Okay, so get this right. A ton of you have sent in, like, a crazy amount of info on Tulsi Gabbard.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and, former congresswoman and all her deep ties to this group, the Science of Identity Foundation.
Mm,
So we've got core documents, we've got forum posts, even some research papers.
really?
Yeah, it's a lot. So we're going to unpack all of it, right? We're going to look into where this group came from, who's running it, and even some pretty surprising financial links, too.
Okay.
So to help us kind of wade through all of this, we've got our expert here with us, ready to connect all the dots and help us, understand what it all means.
I mean, I think what's so fascinating right off the bat is that, Gabbard was actually raised in SIF, right? Like
Right.
her whole political journey in this organization seem very, very intertwined, especially when you look at the fact that 99% of her campaign donations,
I know, it's wild.
yeah, came from SIF members.
It's crazy.
And many of them, had no history of giving to political campaigns before.
It really makes you think, what's their influence?
Totally.
What role are they playing in her political life?
Yeah.
But let's back up a little bit. Okay?
Okay.
For those who don't know, what exactly is the Science of Identity Foundation? What is it?
Well, on the surface, they kind of present themselves as like a pretty standard kind of spiritual organization founded by this guy, Chris Butler,
Okay.
who also goes by this spiritual name, Jagad Guru Siddhaswarapananda Paramahamsa.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's a lot.
So they're rooted in Gaudiya Vaishnavism,
Okay.
which is like a branch of Hinduism.
Got it.
But then, when you start to dig a little bit deeper, you kind of start seeing these contradictions pop up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Butler claims to have this high level of spiritual renunciation, but then, he's living a life of total luxury.
Right.
He's even married.
Yeah, and that clashes with the traditional path of a sannyasi.
Exactly. Yeah, that really stood out to me when I was going through all this material.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that makes you kind of raise an eyebrow and question the authenticity of it all, you know?
Yeah.
And some former members even allege that SIF deviates from the traditional teachings of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and they incorporate elements of another school of thought called Advaita Vedanta.
Okay.
So it kind of begs the question, are these teachings being adapted or maybe even twisted to kind of serve a very specific purpose?
For sure. It makes you wonder if there's a disconnect between what they're presenting to the world and then what's really happening behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And that leads us to, I think, the big question that a lot of people are asking. Is this group a cult?
Right. And several of your sources actually use that label, pointing to behaviors that kind of align with, cult characteristics that are outlined in psychological texts.
Yeah.
Like cults, faith, healing, and coercion.
Yeah.
And these behaviors include things like having a very strict hierarchy.
Yeah.
And controlling information very carefully.
We see a lot of that in Iwachatanya Mission Polisuf 00155.pdf, right?
Yes.
Former members talking about this culture where you can't disagree and anyone who leaves is basically shunned.
And shunning can be such a powerful tool for any group.
Right.
It's a way of reinforcing the idea that they are the holders of the only truth.
Right.
And it really discourages anyone from, even questioning the group or thinking about leaving.
Yeah, it's disturbing to think about what kind of impact that has on people psychologically.
Absolutely.
But speaking of disturbing, there's this whole other layer to this whole story. And it involves this guy, Joseph Bismarck,
Okay.
who's also known as Japadas. And he's a prominent figure in SIF. And he's linked to this very controversial multi-level marketing company called QNet.
Ah, the QNet connection. Yeah. And you probably already know, this company has been surrounded by controversy, allegations of running a pyramid scheme.
Yeah.
And even a connection to a murder in Indonesia.
It's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, it is.
But what's even more interesting is that Bismarck, he actually gifted Butler a multi-million-dollar house.
Wow.
And ownership of this whole down-to-earth health food store chain.
So that adds a whole other dimension to this deep dive, especially when we connect it back to those allegations of financial irregularities within SIF itself.
Yeah, there's even mention of properties being sold.
Right.
And then the money just disappearing.
Yeah, and then there are also these claims of Butler pressuring his followers for donations.
Yes.
Even resorting to threats to get what he wanted.
It's kind of scary to think about.
Yeah.
Right? To think about someone who's in this position of like spiritual authority and using those kinds of tactics. It just feels like such a betrayal of trust.
Oh, absolutely. It is.
You know,
it really is.
And it makes you think, like, how can someone who claims to have like this high level of spiritual awareness, how can they then be engaged in this kind of like manipulative behavior?
Right. It raises questions about accountability for sure.
Time.
Yeah.
And as we're going through all this, I'm struck by this idea of spiritual systems becoming kind of distorted,
Yeah.
like what's mentioned in Cults and Deteriorated Spiritual Systems.pdf.
Yeah.
It warns about these teachings like becoming fossilized and losing their original intent.
Right. It's like they become more about control than actual, genuine growth and transformation.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that source also goes on to like highlight some red flags to watch out for. Like if a group emphasizes outward conformity over like real inner transformation, or if they demand obedience to the leader,
right,
or if they try to isolate members from the outside world.
Right. It's like all signs that things might not be what they seem.
Exactly.
It seems like so much of this just comes down to like the leader's interpretation,
Yeah.
and how they use their power.
It is. It's all about power.
Yeah. It makes me think about how seemingly intelligent people can get drawn into these groups. Like, it's a question that psychologists and sociologists have been trying to figure out for years.
Well, for sure.
Like, what is it about these groups that draw people in?
Yeah, there's this book that you sent me called The True Believer.
Okay.
It really digs into the psychology of mass movements,
Yeah.
And one theory is that people are like drawn to these groups because they offer a sense of belonging and purpose and certainty
Right.
in a world that often feels very chaotic and unpredictable.
Right. And especially when you have a charismatic leader who comes along and is offering these like easy answers to really complex problems, it's tempting to just kind of like turn off your brain and follow,
Yeah, it's very alluring.
Yeah.
Especially in times of, uncertainty or when people are feeling lost.
Totally.
Yeah,
and once you're in that environment,
Yeah.
right? Like surrounded by people who are all like reinforcing the same narrative,
Right.
it becomes so much harder to like question or challenge what the group is saying.
Absolutely. And that's by design a lot of the time,
Yeah. It's scary.
It is.
So what can we learn from all of this?
Yeah.
Like, what are the big takeaways, especially for, anyone listening who might be exploring different spiritual paths or thinking about joining a group? What advice would you give based on your experience with this stuff?
Well, I think, first and foremost, do your research.
Yeah.
Don't just take things at face value,
Well,
Like, look beyond the surface. Talk to people.
Talk to firmer members.
Yeah.
Look for those red flags we talked about.
Yeah.
Does the group encourage critical thinking, or do they demand blind faith?
Right.
Do they try to isolate you from your loved ones?
Yeah.
And most importantly, trust your gut.
Yeah.
If something feels off, it probably is.
Your intuition is usually right.
It really is, yeah.
And remember, like, questioning authority doesn't mean that you're rejecting spirituality.
Right.
It just means that you're taking an active role in your own journey.
Absolutely. It's about being an empowered individual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that goes for any group or belief system, not just these, groups that are labeled as cults.
For sure.
We got to be careful out there.
Yeah. Be discerning.
Yeah.
Especially in a world where we're just bombarded with information all the time.
Right.
Think critically about the messages that you're receiving and where those messages are coming from. Yeah, be an active participant, not just a passive follower.
Exactly.
And if you've had negative experiences with a group,
Yeah.
or someone who has, like, don't hesitate to get help.
Yeah. Reach out.
There are organizations out there.
There are, you included some in your research.
Yeah, cults101.pdf.
Yeah.
That can provide support and resources.
Yeah, there are people who understand and can help.
Yeah, it can be really, really isolating.
It can.
To go through something like that.
It can be really tough.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot in this deep dive, right?
We have.
We've looked at like the political connections, the financial stuff,
Yeah.
the experiences of former members, and it all comes back to this idea of discernment. Like, how do we know what's real?
Yeah.
How do we protect ourselves?
Right.
And I think most importantly, like, how do we hold people who are in positions of power
Yes.
accountable for their actions?
That's the big one.
Right. Big
Big
questions.
questions for sure.
But we'll be right back to wrap up this exploration of the Science of Identity Foundation and all these layers that we've uncovered. We left off talking about some pretty serious accusations against Ceph and its leader, Chris Butler.
Right.
But before we jump into those accounts from former members,
Yeah.
there's something I've been wondering about.
Okay.
Like why should anyone outside of Ceph care about this?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Like, why should anyone outside of, Tulsi Gabbard's political sphere even, care about what's going on with this group?
I think, it's easy to kind of just dismiss this as something that's happening, out there on the fringes of society.
Right.
But this whole deep dive, it actually touches on themes that I think are relevant to everyone.
Right.
Like the allure of these charismatic leaders,
Right.
the dangers of groupthink, the
Right.
need for critical thinking, especially when you're, encountering these organizations that are promising to give you the answers to life's big questions.
Right. It's a good reminder that anyone can be vulnerable to manipulation,
Mm-hmm.
especially people who are maybe seeking a sense of belonging
Totally.
or are struggling with difficult life circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely.
And these former member accounts that we have, in these files, X of members post 000182.pdf and I watch Italian mission Polish 000155.pdf.
Yeah.
They really bring that point home.
They really do. Their stories are really eye-opening. I mean, they allege things like psychological abuse,
Yeah.
manipulation, even cases where families are torn apart because
Yep.
of CIS's influence.
Yeah.
And you included this research that I think really puts these experiences into context.
Right.
Like this traumabusecults.pdf.
Right.
That explains how this kind of trauma can manifest as PTSD, anxiety, depression, even create difficulty forming healthy relationships later on in life.
There was one story that really stuck with me.
Yeah.
About this young woman named Casa who got involved with SIF.
Okay.
And after she left the group, her family described her as mentally regressed.
Wow, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's really sad.
And it highlights the potential for long-lasting harm, It's
Right.
it's not just about the time that someone spends within the group, but the scars that it can leave,
The lasting impact. And on top of the psychological impact,
Yeah.
there are also these allegations of financial exploitation as well.
Oh, right. One of the sources mentions that proceeds from the sale of SIF properties just vanished.
That's poof, gone.
Where did it go? And then
Yeah.
there are these claims that Butler used these pressure tactics,
Yeah.
Even threats to get donations from his followers.
It's just wild to me.
It's pretty chilling to think about, right?
Yeah.
Someone in this position of spiritual authority using those kinds of tactics. I mean, it just feels like a betrayal of trust.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, how can someone who claims to have this high level of spiritual awareness
Right.
then engage in this kind of behavior? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it raises some big questions about accountability.
Yeah, for sure.
Who's holding these people accountable?
Right. And as we're going through all of this, I keep thinking about this idea of spiritual systems becoming distorted.
Oh, yeah.
In Cult Sand Deteriorated Spiritual Systems.pdf.
Yeah.
It warns about these teachings becoming fossilized and losing their original intent.
Right. It's like the teachings become more of a tool for control rather than a path to actual growth.
Exactly. And that source also goes on to highlight these red flags to watch out for. Right?
Oh yeah, like emphasizing outward conformity
Right.
over real inner transformation.
Right. Or demanding obedience to the leader.
Yeah, or isolating members from the outside world. Those are all signs that things might not be what they seem.
Right. Proceed with caution.
Exactly.
Yeah. It just seems like so much of this comes down to the leader's interpretation,
Oh yeah.
and how they use their power.
It is. It's all about power dynamics.
Yeah. And it makes me think about how these seemingly intelligent people can get drawn into these groups?
Yeah.
It's a question that's like fascinated psychologists and sociologists for years, right?
For sure, there's a whole body of research
Yeah.
dedicated to understanding this phenomenon.
Right. Like, what is it about these groups that draws people in?
Right. And there's this one book that you mentioned in your research, The True Believer. That really delves into the psychology of mass movements.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the theories is that people are drawn to these groups because they offer this sense of belonging.
Community.
Yeah.
Purpose.
Purpose and certainty
Right.
in a world that often feels very chaotic and unpredictable.
Especially when you have like a charismatic leader
Oh yeah.
who comes in and is offering these like simple answers
And the answers.
to these like really complex problems.
Yeah.
It's so tempting to just like turn off your brain and follow,
Yeah, absolutely. It's very appealing
Yeah.
to have someone tell you like, this is the way, this is
Right.
the truth, follow me.
Yeah, and once you're in that environment, right?
Yeah.
Like surrounded by all these people who are like reinforcing the same narrative.
Yeah, it's like an echo chamber. You
Yeah.
know, it becomes really hard to question or challenge the group's ideology.
So what can we learn from this?
Yeah, that's the big question.
What are like the big takeaways, especially for anyone who's listening,
Yeah.
who might be exploring different spiritual paths or considering, joining a certain organization. Based on your experience, what advice would you give?
Well, I think, first and foremost, do your research.
Yeah.
Don't just take things at face value. Like
Okay.
look beyond the surface. Talk to former
Yeah,
members.
get their perspective.
Yeah, look for those red flags that we talked about earlier.
Like, does the group encourage critical thinking?
Yeah, or do they demand blind faith?
Right. Do they isolate you?
Yeah, do they try to isolate you from your loved ones? And trust your gut.
Yeah.
If something feels off,
Yeah.
it probably is.
Your intuition is usually right.
It usually is. It's there to protect you.
And remember, like, questioning authority doesn't mean that you're rejecting spirituality.
Right.
It just means that you're taking, like, an active role in your own journey.
Exactly. It's about being an empowered individual on your spiritual path.
Right. And that goes for any group or belief system, not just these,
Yeah.
groups that are labeled as cults.
Any group, any belief system.
Yeah.
Be discerning.
Be careful out there,
Yeah.
especially in a world where we're, like, bombarded with information all the time.
Right. Think critically about the messages you're receiving.
Yeah.
And where they're coming from.
Yeah. Be an active participant, not just a passive follower.
Absolutely. Be engaged. Be curious.
And if you've had like negative experiences with a group,
Yeah.
or someone who has,
Reach out for help.
yeah, there are organizations that can help.
Yeah. You included some in your research.
Yeah, like cults101.pdf.
Yeah. There are resources available.
Yeah, and it can be so isolating
It can
to go through something like that.
It can be really tough to talk about these experiences.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, right?
We've gone deep.
From the political connections
Yeah.
to the financial allegations to the experiences of these former members.
And it all kind of circles back to this idea of discernment.
Right. How do we know what's real?
Right.
How do we protect ourselves?
Yeah.
And maybe most importantly, how do we hold these people who are in positions of power accountable for their actions?
Those are the big questions.
Big questions. And we'll be right back to wrap up this
Okay.
exploration of the Science of Identity Foundation and all these layers that we've uncovered. So we've really gotten deep into this world of SIF.
We have.
And I think it's safe to say there's a lot more to this organization than meets the eye, right?
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack.
Lots of layers.
We've explored these claims of distorted teachings and manipulative tactics and even potential financial impropriety.
Right, but it's important to remember too, like all of this deep dive is based on those specific sources that you sent in, right?
Yeah, it's just a snapshot.
It's just a piece.
Yeah, it's not the whole picture.
Yeah, and we have to acknowledge that, there are probably people out there
Sure.
who have had positive experiences with stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Like people's experiences can vary so widely.
Well, of course.
And what might be harmful for one person could be like totally fine for someone else.
Yeah, and it's worth noting too that stuff like any organization has evolved over time.
Right.
So it's possible that some of those more concerning practices or teachings from the past have been, changed or maybe even abandoned.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
But even with that in mind, like the allegations that we have talked about,
Right.
they are serious, and I think they warrant like careful consideration.
Absolutely. And I think this whole deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
Not a lot to chew on.
It raises these questions about spiritual authority and the nature of belief and the responsibility that we have to ourselves and to each other when it comes to evaluating these claims of truth and enlightenment.
Right. It's easy to get swept up
Oh, it is.
in something that sounds good.
Totally. And I think we've seen how easily spiritual teachings can be distorted.
Right.
How these charismatic leaders can exploit vulnerabilities and
Yeah.
how these group dynamics can silence dissent and reinforce these harmful ideologies.
That's a lot.
It is a lot.
So as we kind of wrap up our exploration of SIF, like what are some key takeaways for our listeners? Like what advice, I mean, you've been following these kinds of groups for years. Yeah. What advice would you give to anyone who might be, thinking about different spiritual paths or considering joining a group?
Well, if I could offer just one piece of advice,
Okay.
it would be this. Trust your gut. Like if something feels off about a group or a leader,
Yeah.
don't ignore that feeling.
Don't ignore it.
Do your research, talk to former members, look for those red flags we talked about earlier.
And remember, it's okay to question authority.
Yes, it's essential.
Yeah.
Critical thinking is your best defense against manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
So don't be afraid to ask tough questions.
Yeah.
To challenge assumptions and to demand transparency.
And if you or someone you know has been involved with a group that you think might be harmful,
Yeah.
like don't hesitate to reach out for help.
There are resources out there,
Absolutely.
organizations that specialize in supporting those who've been affected by cults and other manipulative groups.
It's okay to ask for help.
It is. You don't have to go through it alone.
So we've covered a lot today.
We have.
From the origins of SIF to these accusations of cult-like behavior, right, to the complex power of Chris Butler himself.
It's been a journey.
And while this particular deep dive is coming to an end,
Yeah.
I think it's left us with some pretty important questions to think about.
It have.
Like how do we figure out what are the authentic spiritual teachings versus the ones that are meant to control and manipulate?
That's the big one, right?
Yeah, and what responsibility do public figures have to be transparent about their affiliations?
Right.
Especially when those affiliations raise like ethical concerns.
Yeah, that's a big one too.
And maybe most importantly, like how do we cultivate that critical thinking?
Yeah.
And healthy skepticism.
In a world that just wants us to believe everything.
Right, especially in a world where we're just bombarded with information constantly.
Constantly.
And so much of it is designed to get us to buy into a certain narrative.
It is. It's a lot to navigate.
So to our listener out there,
Yeah.
we leave you with those questions.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay informed.
Stay informed. Stay critical.
And keep asking those tough questions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.